My name is Jason, and this is Just Watches. Okay, today we have something a bit different. I want to show you my King Seiko 45 7001, but I also wanted to add a little context with some history first. You see, King Seiko as a brand no longer exists, but it plays an important role in the history of both Seiko and Grand Seiko. So Seiko was founded in 1881 by Kentaro Hattori when he founded Hattori and Company in Tokyo, Japan. This business started out as a Western watch and clock vendor and repair shop. However, after 9 years in business repairing Western watches, Kentaro Hattori decided that he wanted to start producing Japanese-made watches and clocks. As Seiko watches became more popular in Japan, Hattori built the Daini factory in Tokyo in 1937. In 1942, a second factory named Suwa was built to supply parts to the original Daini factory to produce more watches. However, after Kentaro Hattori died, the company was taken over by his son Genzo Hattori. In an effort to drive innovation and quality, he decided to run these two factories as separate entities and pit them against one another. These are the two logos of the two separate divisions. Spoiler alert, this strategy was highly effective. Seeking to produce higher-end watches, Suwa would give rise to Grand Seiko in 1960. The goal was to make the ideal watch. It had to be precise, durable, easy to wear, and as beautiful as possible. The first Grand Seiko caliber was the 3180, which had a stated accuracy of +12 to -3 seconds a day. Not to be outdone, Daini would create the King Seiko line in 1963. The first King Seiko caliber was the caliber 44. This was a hand-winding 18,000 vibration per hour caliber. Now, to get to the King Seiko 45, let's backtrack a few years. Prior to the Grand Seiko, Suwa actually produced a watch known as the Lord Marvel that used the caliber LM5740. This was a super high beat movement that had an astonishing beat rate of 36,000 vibrations per hour or 10 beats per second. This was Japan's and one of the world's first 36,000 vibration per hour movements. Grand Seiko would use this technology in their Caliber 45 G series, and to compete with that movement, King Seiko introduced their own Caliber 45. While the King Seiko movement is not as highly finished, and it lacks chronometer grade rating, it was also a 36,000 vibration per hour movement and was extremely accurate. These calibers would go on to rival even the best Swiss watches of the time before both lines were halted due to the quartz crisis. And while Grand Seiko would return in 1998, the King Seiko line was never resurrected, which makes it an interesting and collectible piece of history from Seiko. Alright, after that brief bit of history, let's take a look at my King Seiko 45 7001. Now, this example does have a few flaws, but I picked this one for two specific reasons. First, a really clean example can cost close to $1,000, and I wasn't prepared to spend that much on my first real exploration into vintage watches. Second, I had my heart intent on servicing this watch. One of the challenges of getting into vintage watches is finding a place to get them serviced. The service can be expensive, and ideally you want someone that is familiar with servicing vintage watches. The other challenge is that parts for these older watches are very hard to come by. This watch was manufactured in 1970, so it's 50 years old. Often the only way to get parts for a watch like this is to use another watch as a donor. Since I had slowly been building up my skill set working on movements and some older Seikos, I felt ready that I could service this movement, but I didn't want to risk a pristine model as these King Seikos are an irreplaceable part of Seiko's history. Fortunately, the service went fine, which was very exciting on a few fronts. First, with the watch serviced, I didn't have to worry about wearing it regularly. And second, all of my practice and hard work stripping down and rebuilding movements had paid off into something pretty tangible. I am still an absolute amateur, and I'm sure if this watch needed a major repair, like fitting a new jewel, I would have been stuck, but luckily all it needed was a nice clean and fresh oil, as the watch in this oil had long ago dried up. So, with that disclaimer out of the way. I'll go into the usual review. We'll do the specifications. I won't really do pros and cons on this vintage watch. This isn't something you would just go order on Amazon. You kind of have to do your research and find a vendor. But I will have some thoughts on getting into vintage watches at the end of the video. So for the case, we have a 36.5 millimeter case diameter. It's 41 millimeters lug to lug. It's very thin. It's only 9.5 millimeters thick. And that's partially due to the fact that this is a manual wind only movement. So there's no rotor that adds additional thickness to the watch. And then the lug width is 18 millimeters, which is nice because you have a lot of strap options. Now the case is completely high polish, and this one has probably been polished in the past. It has lost some of the very sharp transitions that you'll usually see on these lugs, but that was part of the reason I was able to get a good deal on it. But I do love the way that the sides of the case are long, and they just have this elegant kind of swoop to them that really helps them catch light. And you can see it's all high polished down the sides as well. And the lugs are quite distinct. Now, if these were these really sharp transitions, it would look even more striking. But even on this watch that has clearly been worn and shown a lot of use over the years, it's still just gorgeous to look at. Now, this is not the original strap, but it did come with the original pin and collar. And you can see it's very highly decorated. So you have that KS for King Seiko, that's high polish, but then surrounding that you have these lines, these vertical lines etched in, and it's just a very handsome pin and collar, and it kind of fits the motif. You'll see KS on a lot of places throughout the watch as we go through this review, and I just really like that this pin and collar was available. I just transferred it onto this Barton quick release strap, and it was a perfect fit. So if you do find one with the pin and collar, just know you can transfer them to a different strap. Flipping it over reveals another really cool detail of this watch, the King Seiko and Grand Seikos of this era, and I believe some of the Omegas did this. They have these gold medallions in the middle of the caseback, saying Seiko and KS for King Seiko there. It's a really cool and interesting feature. Now, a lot of times these are missing because I think they could corrode off, and I think people would actually remove them to try to, salvage some of the value because this is gold plated. I don't think there's very much gold in it, but nevertheless, people did take them off of the backs of these watches. And then a lot of times they get a little bit corroded. Like you can see on the S on mine, there's some corrosion there, but overall this one's in pretty good shape. And then you just have some other information around the edge there, stainless steel, the 45 7001 and waterproof, and then Japan. And as we said before, the movement in this is the venerable 4500A. So this watch is hand wind only with a blistering 36,000 vibrations per hour or 10 beats per second. It's absolutely gorgeous with a full balance bridge and a deep etching of the details of the watch. It's a Seiko, the serial number, and the name of the movement. There were actually higher grades of this movement, including the Grand Seiko version that had a chronometer rating, but these King Seikos didn't carry chronometer ratings, but even this 50-year-old movement is still running close to 0 seconds a day. The crown is another place that the KS makes that motif kind of makes its appearance. This is beautiful. It's deeply etched into the crown there. You can see the KS, and then it's got kind of like a brushed finish on the background of the KS that really just makes it pop. And then the crown is nice. You have a kind of like a step down before you get to the knurling of the crown. It is a hand wind only movement. It is actually pretty difficult to wind because the thickness of the mainspring required to drive this movement. But you do just hand wind it, and it is okay for that operation. And it is just a push-pull crown, but interesting that this movement actually does have a hacking lever. It was crazy. It's like 3 separate parts that all work together to hack the movement. So you can hack the movement, which is really nice because this watch is very accurate. So being able to hack the movement, you can get a very accurate time reading on this watch. The crystal is original. It is slightly damaged on this bottom left area. There's some scrapes and there's a little bit of damage on the edge of the facet, but man, this crystal is really cool. Now, I don't think Hardlex was invented yet. I think this might just be a mineral crystal, but you can see on these original crystals, it's proud of the bezel, and there's a really cool facet that goes all the way around. So I really like that detail. It's really cool to look at from the side, and the watch is already so thin. Even with that raised glass of the crystal, it keeps the watch, it's still thin overall. So pulling in a little bit closer, the dial, you can start to see that sunburst effect. It's this very, very kind of light champagne color, and you do have that bursting sunburst effect from the center of the watch there. You have Seiko applied at the 12 o'clock, and then the KS, again, that motif is present throughout the watch there for King Seiko is at the 6 o'clock, and then you just have high beat printed there, and then you have the symbol. Remember, we went over those before. That's the Daini symbol just below where they had marked high beat. Now the indices are this unique and interesting combination of high polish on the sides and then a flat black matte finish on the top. It helps to make the indices very legible in different lighting conditions. And even in bright lighting conditions, I just love the way the edges kind of catch the light, but then it is counterbalanced by that black surface that doesn't reflect light at all. Very interesting on this watch. And that styling is also present on the hands. You see you have these long minute and hour hands that have the same kind of finishing. High polish, there's a gable down the middle, so the light is just catching the bottom edge of these hands. High polish on the sides with that flat black down the middle. And I just find wearing this throughout the day, it plays with the light in really interesting ways, and it keeps the watch really legible. A lot of times on a dress watch where all the surfaces are high polish, sometimes in more bright and direct light, you do kind of lose the ability to see the time. But in this watch, because of those black surfaces, you're always able to read the time on this. And then we have that long second hand that's going all the way out to the edge of the dial. And you'll be able to see that mesmerizing 10 beats per second. It just kind of floats along the dial there. Now it's interesting because this second hand is actually indirectly driven with its own special gear. So when it does fight gravity, it tends to stutter because it's so long. You'll probably be able to see that as it comes up across the 6 o'clock and into the 7, it does get a little bit of a vibration, which is kind of funny. But whenever it isn't fighting gravity, or it's not always present, but especially when gravity is in the second hand's favor, it just returns to that ultra smooth sweep. It's just gorgeous to watch it basically float along the dial. So there it is on my 6 3/4 inch wrist. It's a vintage watch, so they're much smaller. They were much smaller in the 70s. This is 36.5 millimeters, but I think it wears a little bit more like a 38. And you can see, I think it looks fine on my wrist. Especially it's a very dressy piece. I think it's okay to have that smaller size. And you can see I transferred that pin and buckle to this Barton strap, and I think it's a lovely pairing. I think it does complement the black surfaces on the hands and the indices. I might experiment with some other crazy colors, maybe green, red, or blue on this one. If you guys have any strap suggestions, go ahead and leave them in the comments. But yeah, this is just a killer watch. I've been really happy with it. I think it's super interesting, and it's just a pleasure. It's been a pleasure to own so far. So pros and cons then. Well, pros, I'm pretty obsessed with this watch and this movement. Just from the history of the movement and the 36,000 vibrations per hour, the elegant case, the interesting combination of brushed and matte black surfaces on the dial and indices. Overall, this is just a really interesting and gorgeous watch. Obviously, on the cons, they're not practical to own. Buying a vintage watch is a difficult universe to navigate. So even in my case where I was comfortable servicing the watch, in the case that a component is damaged, finding a replacement is going to be incredibly difficult. So I don't fully recommend vintage watches in general. However, I think if you find a vintage watch you are drawn to and you learn as much about that watch as you can, I think vintage watch hunting really rewards knowledge over everything else. So after you look at countless examples of a model you're interested in and you ask the right questions, you're personally going to start recognizing all of the subtle details you're looking for to make sure that a vintage watch is in both good condition and isn't fake or frankened. So if it's something you want to explore and you're willing to do the research, I think there is a lot of treasure and rich history to explore in the vintage watch world. You just have to be really careful about the way that you navigate it and make sure you know what you're getting into. And there we have it, the King Seiko 45 7001. All right, thank you guys so much for watching. If you're enjoying the content of this channel, I invite you to subscribe. And if you like the contents of this individual video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Until next time, this is Jason, and you've been watching Just Watches.